As Adnan said, my interest in research is really about re-indigenization, how indigenous qualities of life can be maintained and promoted within the world's future. So I'm going to start there with some comments about indigenous life. And the word indigenous has its roots in ecology, for within this type of framework of knowledge is found the practical application of the word indigenous. That is, those organisms that have symbiotic relationships with a contiguous, independent environment are indigenous. Of course, one might wonder about ducks and geese that fly out and occupy several ecosystems, breeding in one and resting in another and feeding in others. The answer is also an ecological axiom. Ecosystems are complex, overlapping, multidimensional, much like human societies. In fact, this is the norm for truly indigenous societies in which transitions and transient qualities of gender, justice, governance, spirituality, seasonal migrations, etc., contribute to the great diversity of human experience. Pinning down indigenous difference for comparison is a futile effort. Only when looking at complementary qualities can we see how indigeneity in all of its forms emerges from the earth itself, what we are made of, from which there is no alternative except constructed, imaginative realities that are constrained within the successive epochs of modernity. So, in the world that we live in, there are highly ideological societies, and there are a multiplicity of indigenous societies which draw their origins from the earth itself, where the ideological societies are created out of sets of imagined ideas. Well, let's get something straight about indigeneity. Indigeneity is not about who came first. The world is too old for that. There's too many overlaps. An unsustainable society that establishes the first unsustainable outpost on Mars is not going to be indigenous to Mars. People won't be able to call themselves Martians. Indigeneity is also not about who God gave land to in the past. Only in a Western world can we conceive of God as a real estate agent. While it takes generations to get to know the land and for a people to develop sustainable knowledge systems and languages to express the detail and in detail that knowledge, I know, I'm more talking. Indigeneity is not about the past. There is a presence about indigeneity, or else it is simply an artifact that belongs in a museum. Indigeneity is of the present. This brings us to colonialism. The process of de-indigenizing people and environments, the act of commodifying resources which indigenous people had dependence upon, or destroying environments to get to commodities that the indigenous people did not even know were there, that's colonialism. How does such a process begin? Who does such a thing? The simple answer is people who have nothing else to lose. This is why colonial societies are based on ideological underpinnings rather than emerge from naturally from ecology. This is an existential dilemma in which the colonizer has ceased to belong and therefore needs things to belong to him. Colonial societies begin more often than not in a state of defeat and poverty initiated by acts of genocide or ethnocide which have been perpetrated against them and progress through a long series of isms to get paid back. The natural course of this trajectory is eventual collapse, to begin and then collapse in their own ideologies. Such societies inadvertently create exhaustible inevitabilities rather than achieving the lofty goals they espouse to affirm their superiority. And they leave in their wake fertile ground upon which emerging ideologies become the excuse to do it all over again. Colonialism is both structure and process, and as such has a variety of forms and intentions. In North America, we've experienced some of these forms. For instance, administrative colonialism. Administrative colonialism can be seen in the Hudson's Bay Company rule of the North and the Northwest, the Indian Act, and even Section 35, which has been touted to be an advancement for Aboriginal people. Because our present Constitution, as an instrument of administration, administrates our identity, contrives to control what indigeneity is. That's why the Department of Indian Affairs has shifted to the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, and now calls itself the Department of Indigenous Affairs and Northern Development. It simply can't make up its mind on what it actually is, or what we are. But it takes the control about our agency in deciding who we are. Administrative colonialism can take on aspects of landscape and geography as well, where road systems, urban planning, checkpoints control mobility, and therefore control access to employment, investment, and even cultural expressions. We see this form of administrative colonialism at work in the Israeli state. On the prairies of Canada in the early 20th century, the state used a pass system to control indigenous mobility. And today, Section 1 and Section 6.1 and Section 6.2 administratively influence indigenous choices in marriage and passing on inheritance of Aboriginal identity and access to indigenous rights. We're very familiar with settler colonialism in North America. Indigenous populations were surrounded and often overwhelmed by the demands of desperate migrants. Often people who had been removed from their own sense of belonging and enticed with promising futures, New Jerusalem, visions of ideological utopias. Migrant settlers are really used as cheap labor, the tools to clear land for industrial agriculture and to hold land aggressively against indigenous resistance and return. Although governments like the US and Canada have protested settler colonial expansion into the West Bank of Palestine, Israel can point back and ask why did you build your countries on settler colonialism? Extractive colonialism is still the rule in Canada and is a main source of economic nationalism. Extractive colonialism focuses on the acquisition of resources to increase an economic system of expanding consumption, or what economists describe as progressive markets. The system relies on profitability based on the market paying more than the cost of materials and production. However, in a finite world of non-renewable resources and ever-increasing real needs, profits are more often than not gained through externalizing the cost of production onto labor, natural ecosystems and their functions, and the displacement of indigeneity. As long as the colonial society does not experience discomfort, then the consequences of such insidious degradation of humanity and environments goes on unnoticed. As long as Israel continues to look like Southern California, then no matter how thirsty Palestinians become, no one in Israel will take notice. The violence of displacement and poverty are blamed on what appear to be religious or ideological differences in the same way that Oka or Burnt Church are blamed on cultural grievances rather than the poverty that's created. The structures of colonialism are supported through the exercise of processes. Qualities such as racism, sexism, and religious intolerance are exploited to function as identity markers that separate and control identities. Colonialism is dependent on essentializing indigenous identity, reducing it down to its lowest common denominators. In this way, indigenous identity becomes a commodity, and as Fanon aptly pointed out, even the colonized come to demand the masks that are assigned to them. The indigenous identity takes on self-fulfilling characteristics as the oppressed, the helpless, the downtrodden. As well, they are characterized as ancient, primitive, unsophisticated, and they are seen as occupants of the past rather than present or future people. Their futures are worth preserving by the colonial society as anachronistic lessons that might show some real sacred truths or spiritual wisdom when and if modernity gets around to needing it. Often, as the Algonquins of the Ottawa Valley, they are seen as recent immigrants to their indigenous relationship with their place and therefore lack authenticity. These are the very characteristics that are often used to describe displaced Palestinians and residents of North Winnipeg. There's a certain logic to the exercise of colonialism. About a little bit less than a year and a half ago, I was detained by the IDF for hoping to enter into Palestine. And in the process, I was roughed up and interrogated. I noticed before I was going into an interrogation that one of the sort of senior interrogators was walking by, and he very kindly offered me some oranges and some water, which I didn't take. And then he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Not very well." He said, "Oh." I said, "Yeah, considering that I was tasered this morning and beaten up, not very well." He said, "Oh, you were tasered?" I said, "Yeah, I was tasered." He said, "You must have been doing something wrong." I said, "Well, you know, in a logical world that would make sense, but this is a quite illogical situation." He said, "Oh," and he looked at me straight in the face with the most serious expression and said, "It's our job to make everything logical." True democracy, egalitarian society cannot walk hand in hand with colonialism. Democracy and colonialism cannot walk hand in hand. Understanding the nature of colonialism, not just feeling guilty or disconnected, is what we actually need to do to confront and resist destructive powers of the destructive power of ideological states. It is no longer a choice to remain idle. Miigwech.